Margaret Williams had been cleaning houses for 37 years, and she thought she had seen everything. At 62, her hands were rough from countless hours of scrubbing, polishing, and organizing the lives of wealthy families who barely acknowledged her presence. She moved through their marble hallways like a ghost, invisible to most, essential to all. The Hamilton mansion stood like a fortress on the hills of Beverly Hills, its white columns gleaming against the California sun. Margaret had been working there for 3 years, arriving every Tuesday and Friday at 7 in the morning sharp. She knew every corner of the 12-bedroom estate, every family portrait that lined the walls, every expensive vase that needed careful dusting. Richard Hamilton was different from her other employers, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. The tech entrepreneur had built his fortune from nothing, creating software that revolutionized how people manage their finances. At 45, he was worth over $200 million, yet he always greeted Margaret by name when their paths crossed. On this particular Tuesday morning in November, Margaret noticed something unusual. Richard was sitting at his kitchen island, still in his pajamas at 9 o'clock, staring blankly at his laptop screen. His usually perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Hamilton," Margaret said softly as she began organizing the breakfast dishes his housekeeper had left behind. He looked up, seeming surprised to see her. "Oh, Margaret. Good morning. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you come in." Margaret had worked for enough wealthy families to recognize the signs of stress, even when hidden behind expensive clothes and perfect smiles. Something was troubling Richard Hamilton, and it was more than just business concerns. As she moved around the kitchen, cleaning and organizing with practiced efficiency, she couldn't help but notice the papers scattered across the counter. Medical bills, insurance forms, and what looked like hospital discharge papers were mixed in with his usual business documents. "Mr. Hamilton, is everything all right?" she asked hesitantly. It wasn't her place to pry, but 37 years of cleaning houses had taught her that sometimes people needed someone to ask. Richard looked up again, this time really seeing her. In all the months she had worked for him, he had never really looked at her, not the way he was looking now. He saw the genuine concern in her eyes, the way she had paused in her work to check on him. "My daughter," he said quietly. "Emma. She's in the hospital." Margaret's heart sank. She had seen photos of Emma throughout the house, a bright-faced girl with her father's dark hair and her mother's gentle eyes. "I'm so sorry to hear that. Is she going to be okay?" Richard ran his hands through his hair, making it even more disheveled. "The doctors think so. She was in a car accident 3 days ago. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit her car head-on. She's been in a coma since then, but the doctors say her brain activity is normal. They think she'll wake up soon." "Thank God for that," Margaret said, meaning every word. "Children are resilient. She'll pull through." "The thing is," Richard continued, as if he hadn't heard her, "I've been sitting here for 3 days thinking about everything I've done wrong as a father. All the school plays I missed, the soccer games I couldn't attend because of business meetings, the family dinners I skipped because of conference calls." Margaret set down her cleaning cloth and turned to face him fully. This was new territory for her. In 37 years, she had never had an employer open up to her like this. "I built this empire," Richard gestured around the massive kitchen, "thinking I was providing for my family. But what good is all of this if I'm not there for the people who matter most?" Margaret thought about her own children, now grown with families of their own. She thought about all the times she had to work late, missing their school events because she was taking care of other people's homes. She understood the guilt he was feeling more than he knew. "Mr. Hamilton," she said gently, "you can't change the past, but you can change what happens next. Your daughter is going to wake up, and when she does, she's going to need her father." Richard looked at her with something that might have been surprise. "You have children, don't you, Margaret?" "3, she said with pride. 2 sons and a daughter. They're all adults now, with children of their own." "Do you regret working so much when they were young?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I regret that I had to, but I don't regret providing for them. Sometimes we do what we have to do to survive, to give our children a better life than we had." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the wealthy tech entrepreneur and the woman who cleaned his house, both understanding the weight of parental responsibility in their own ways. Richard's phone rang, breaking the moment. he answered quickly, his face lighting up with the first genuine smile Margaret had seen from him all morning. "She's awake," he said after hanging up. "Emma's awake, and she's asking for me." "That's wonderful news," Margaret said, feeling tears prick at her eyes. "You should go to her." Richard stood up quickly, then paused. "Margaret, I want you to know how much I appreciate everything you do for this family. I know I don't say it enough. Just go be with your daughter," Margaret said with a smile. After Richard left, Margaret continued her work, but her heart felt lighter. She had always taken pride in making homes beautiful and comfortable for the families who lived in them, but today felt different. Today, she felt like she had done something that mattered beyond cleaning and organizing. 2 weeks later, Emma Hamilton came home from the hospital. Margaret was working when Richard's wife Sarah brought their daughter through the front door. Emma was walking with a slight limp and had a bandage on her forehead, but she was alive and smiling. Margaret watched from the hallway as the family embraced in their grand foyer. It was a private moment, but she couldn't help but feel a small sense of joy at seeing them reunited. Over the following weeks, Margaret noticed changes in the Hamilton household. Richard was home more often, working from his home office instead of going to his downtown headquarters every day. Family dinners became regular occurrences, and Margaret often arrived to find the breakfast dishes evidence of a family that had eaten together before starting their day. One Friday morning in December, Margaret arrived to find Richard waiting for her in the kitchen. This was unusual, as he was typically either in his office or already gone by the time she started her work. "Margaret, I have something I want to discuss with you," he said, gesturing for her to sit at the kitchen island. Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness. In her experience, when employers wanted to have serious conversations, it usually meant bad news. She wondered if the family no longer needed her services, if perhaps Richard's increased presence at home meant they wanted more privacy. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation that morning when Emma was in the hospital," Richard began. "You showed me kindness and wisdom when I needed it most, and I realize I don't know very much about your life outside of this house." Margaret remained silent, unsure where this conversation was heading. "I know you work for several other families besides us. I know you take the bus to get around the city. I know you've been cleaning houses for decades. But I don't know about your dreams, your goals, what you want for your future." "Mr. Hamilton, I'm not sure I understand what you're asking." Richard pulled out a small piece of plastic from his pocket and placed it on the counter between them. It was a credit card, black with gold lettering, the kind Margaret had only seen in the wallets of her wealthy employers. "This card has a $50,000 limit," Richard said quietly. "I want you to have it." Margaret stared at the card as if it were a dangerous animal. "Mr. Hamilton, I can't possibly accept that." "I don't understand why you would." "Let me finish," he said gently. "That morning when Emma was in the hospital, you could have just done your job and left me alone with my worries. Instead, you took the time to listen, to offer comfort, to remind me what was truly important. You treated me like a human being, not just an employer." Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes, but she still couldn't touch the card. "I started thinking about how little I know about the people who work for my family. You've been taking care of our home for 3 years, making our lives easier and more comfortable, and I've never once asked you about your own life, your own needs, your own dreams. That's not your responsibility, Mr. Hamilton. I'm here to do a job." "But you're more than that," Richard said firmly. "You're a person with your own hopes and dreams and challenges, and I want to know what those are." Margaret looked at the credit card again, then back at Richard's earnest face. "Mr. Hamilton, this is too much. I can't accept such a generous gift. It wouldn't be right." "It's not a gift," Richard said. "It's an opportunity. I want you to use this card for whatever you need, whatever you want, whatever will make your life better. Maybe it's fixing your car, or helping your children, or taking a vacation, or going back to school, or starting a business. Whatever it is, I want you to have the freedom to choose." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she continued to stare at the card. In 37 years of working for wealthy families, she had received Christmas bonuses, occasional raises, and thank you gifts. But nothing like this. Nothing that came with such trust and freedom. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. Richard was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "Because that morning in the hospital, you reminded me what it means to be human. You showed me kindness without expecting anything in return. You made me realize that success isn't just about building wealth, it's about building connections with the people around us. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the gesture, but also deeply uncertain. She had learned to be cautious about gifts that seemed too good to be true. She had seen other domestic workers get into trouble by accepting things they shouldn't have. Mr. Hamilton, I appreciate this more than you know, but I need to think about it. This is a big responsibility, and I want to make sure I understand what you're asking of me. Richard smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen since Emma's accident. Of course. Take all the time you need. The card will be here when you're ready. As Margaret continued her work that day, she couldn't stop thinking about the credit card sitting on the kitchen counter. It represented more money than she had ever had access to at one time. It represented trust from a man who barely knew her beyond her work. It represented possibilities she had never dared to imagine. But it also represented something else, a test. What would she do with such unexpected freedom? What would her choices say about who she was as a person? That evening, Margaret sat in her small apartment in East Los Angeles, looking out at the city lights and thinking about the conversation with Richard Hamilton. She thought about her own children, now adults struggling with their own financial challenges. She thought about her granddaughter who was brilliant in school, but worried about how to pay for college. She thought about her sister who had been diagnosed with diabetes and was struggling to afford her medication. She thought about her own dreams, the ones she had put aside decades ago when she became a single mother and had to focus solely on survival. She had always wanted to open a small catering business, using her grandmother's recipes to bring joy to people through food. But that dream had seemed impossible when she was working multiple jobs just to keep a roof over her family's head. Now, suddenly, the impossible seemed possible. But was it right to accept such a generous offer? And what did Richard Hamilton really expect in return? Margaret pulled out her phone and called her oldest son, Michael, who lived across town with his wife and 2 children. "Mama, how are you?" Michael's warm voice filled her small apartment. "I'm fine, baby. I just wanted to ask you something. If someone offered you something that seemed too good to be true, what would you do?" Michael laughed. "Mama, you know what Grandma always said. If something seems too good to be true, it usually is. Why are you asking?" Margaret told her son about the credit card, about Richard Hamilton's offer, about her confusion and uncertainty. $50,000? Michael's voice rose in surprise. "Mama, that's incredible, but it does sound suspicious. What does this man want from you?" "I don't think he wants anything. I think he's just trying to be kind. Rich people don't give away money for no reason," Michael said skeptically. "There's got to be a catch." After hanging up with her son, Margaret felt more confused than before. She trusted Michael's judgment, but she also trusted her own instincts about people. And her instincts told her that Richard Hamilton was sincere. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the Hamilton house with her mind made up. She would politely decline the credit card and continue working as she always had. It was safer, simpler, and less complicated. But when she arrived, she found a note from Richard explaining that he had been called away on an emergency business trip. The credit card was still sitting on the kitchen counter, along with a longer letter. Margaret read the letter as she sipped her morning coffee in the Hamiltons' beautiful kitchen. In it, Richard explained more about his reasons for the offer. He wrote about growing up in poverty, about his own mother who worked multiple jobs to support her family, about the people who had helped him along the way when he needed it most. He wrote about Emma's accident and how it had made him realize that life was precious and uncertain, that kindness mattered more than success, that human connections were the only things that truly lasted. He wrote about wanting to pay forward the kindness that others had shown him, about recognizing that Margaret represented all the hard-working people who made other people's lives possible, but rarely got recognized for their contributions. By the time Margaret finished reading the letter, she was crying. Not because she was sad, but because someone had finally seen her, really seen her, as more than just the woman who cleaned their house. For the first time in 37 years, Margaret felt Lee Margaret Williams stared at the black credit card for 3 days before she finally picked up the phone to call Richard Hamilton. The small piece of plastic had been sitting in her purse like a burning coal, impossible to ignore yet too frightening to touch. "Mr. Hamilton, this is Margaret. she said when he answered on the second ring. Margaret, I'm so glad you called. I was hoping you would. Have you had time to think about my offer? Margaret took a deep breath. I have, and I want to accept it, but I need to understand something first. What do you really want from me in return? Richard was quiet for a moment. I want you to use it to make your life better. That's all. No strings attached, no hidden expectations. I want you to have the same opportunities that I've been fortunate enough to have. And what if I make mistakes? What if I spend the money on something you don't approve of? Then, you make mistakes, Richard said simply. That's part of being human. The money is yours to use as you see fit. I trust your judgment. That word, trust, hung in the air between them. Margaret had been trusted with expensive jewelry, with house keys, with family secrets overheard during her years of service. But she had never been trusted with this kind of financial freedom. All right, she said finally. I'll take the card. But I want you to know that I don't take this lightly. This is more than money to me. This is a chance to change my family's life. I'm glad, Richard said, and Margaret could hear the smile in his voice. I can't wait to see what you do with it. After hanging up, Margaret sat in her small living room and made a list. She had learned long ago that the only way to accomplish big things was to break them down into small, manageable steps. First, she would take care of the immediate needs. Her sister Rosa had been rationing her diabetes medication because she couldn't afford to fill her prescriptions every month. Her grandson David needed a laptop for school, and his mother couldn't afford to buy him one. Her daughter Carmen's car had been making strange noises for months, but Carmen couldn't afford to fix it. These were the emergencies, the things that kept Margaret awake at night worrying about her family. These would be her first priority. But then, there were the dreams, the possibilities she had never dared to consider. The catering business she had always imagined. The small restaurant where she could serve her grandmother's recipes. The cooking classes she could take to expand her skills. Margaret looked at her grandmother's recipe book, its pages yellowed with age and splattered with decades of cooking. Her grandmother had come to Los Angeles from Mexico in the 1940s, carrying nothing but these recipes and a determination to build a better life for her family. Mija, her grandmother used to say, food is love made visible. When you cook for someone, you give them a piece of your heart. Margaret had been cooking her grandmother's recipes for her own family for decades, but she had never considered that they might be the foundation of something bigger. The next morning, Margaret went to the bank to activate the credit card. The process was surprisingly simple, though the banker looked at her with curiosity when he saw the credit limit. This is quite a generous limit, Mrs. Williams. Are you planning any major purchases? Something like that, Margaret said, not wanting to explain the complicated story behind the card. Her first stop was the pharmacy where Rosa filled her prescriptions. Margaret knew the pharmacist, Mrs. Chun, who had always been kind to the Williams family. I'd like to pay for my sister's medication for the next 6 months, Margaret said, placing the credit card on the counter. Mrs. Chun looked surprised. That's very generous of you, Margaret. Are you sure? That's going to be quite expensive. I'm sure, Margaret said, thinking about all the time she had seen Rosa counting pills, trying to make them last longer than they were supposed to. The total came to $1,800. Margaret's hands shook slightly as she signed the receipt, but she felt a deep satisfaction knowing that Rosa wouldn't have to worry about her medication for months. Next, she went to the electronics store where she bought David a laptop. The salesperson tried to upsell her to a more expensive model, but Margaret knew exactly what her grandson needed for his schoolwork. This one will do just fine, she said, pointing to a mid-range laptop that would serve David well throughout high school. He doesn't need all the fancy features. He needs something reliable. When she surprised David with the laptop that evening, his reaction was worth every penny. The 17-year-old's eyes widened in disbelief, then filled with tears. Grandma, you didn't have to do this. I know money is tight. It's not tight today, Mijo, Margaret said, hugging her grandson. Today we celebrate your education. The car repair for her daughter Carmen was more complicated. The mechanic found several problems that needed attention, and the final bill came to $2,500. Carmen cried when Margaret told her the car was fixed and paid for. Mom, where did you get this money? Please tell me you didn't do something dangerous or illegal. Margaret laughed, understanding her daughter's concern. Nothing dangerous or illegal, Mija. Someone was very kind to me, and I'm passing that kindness along to our family." Within 2 weeks, Margaret had spent nearly $6,000 on her family's immediate needs. Each purchase felt strange and liberating at the same time. For the first time in her adult life, she was able to solve problems with money instead of just worrying about them. But the real test came when she started thinking about her own dreams. Margaret had always been a careful shopper, comparing prices and looking for bargains. The idea of spending money on herself, on something that wasn't absolutely necessary, felt almost sinful. Yet she found herself standing outside a culinary school in downtown Los Angeles, reading the course descriptions posted in the window. Professional cooking techniques, restaurant management, food safety certification, business planning for food service entrepreneurs. The courses weren't cheap. A comprehensive program would cost nearly $8,000. But, as Margaret read the descriptions, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: excitement about her own future. She pushed open the door and walked inside. "Can I help you?" asked a young woman behind the reception desk. "I'd like to know more about your cooking programs," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman, whose name tag read Jessica, smiled warmly. "Are you looking to start a career in food service? Or is this more of a hobby?" "I've been thinking about starting a small catering business," Margaret said, the words feeling strange in her mouth. "I have my grandmother's recipes, and people have always said I should do something with them." Jessica's eyes lit up. "That's wonderful. Family recipes are often the foundation of the best food businesses. Let me show you our entrepreneurial track." For the next hour, Jessica walked Margaret through the program options, explaining how the courses would teach her not just advanced cooking techniques, but also food safety, business planning, marketing, and financial management. "The thing about the food industry," Jessica explained, "is that loving to cook isn't enough. You need to understand the business side if you want to succeed." Margaret thought about all the years she had spent managing other people's households, organizing their schedules, making sure everything ran smoothly. She had more business experience than she had realized. "How long is the program?" Margaret asked. "The full entrepreneurial track is 6 months if you go part-time, 3 months if you go full-time. Most of our students work while they're in the program." Margaret thought about her current work schedule. She cleaned houses 4 days a week for various families. She could probably rearrange her schedule to attend classes, or she could temporarily reduce her workload. For the first time in decades, Margaret had choices. Real choices about how to spend her time and energy. "I'd like to enroll," she said, surprised by her own boldness. Jessica smiled. "Wonderful. Let's get you set up." As Margaret filled out the enrollment paperwork, she thought about what Richard Hamilton had said about trusting her judgment. This was a leap of faith, not just in the program, but in herself. That evening, Margaret called her children to tell them about her decision to enroll in cooking school. "Mom, are you sure about this?" asked her son Michael. "You're 62 years old. Isn't it a little late to be starting over?" "Maybe," Margaret said. "Or maybe it's exactly the right time." Her daughter Carmen was more supportive. "I think it's amazing, Mom. You've been taking care of everyone else your whole life. It's time to do something for yourself." Margaret's youngest son, Roberto, was characteristically direct. "How are you paying for all this, Mom?" "First David's laptop, then Carmen's car, now cooking school." "Did you win the lottery or something?" Margaret had been dreading this question. How could she explain Richard Hamilton's generosity without it sounding unbelievable? "I received an unexpected gift from someone I work for," she said carefully. "Someone who wanted to help me pursue my dreams." "What kind of gift?" Roberto pressed. "The kind that comes with trust and respect," Margaret said. "The kind that reminds you that good people still exist in the world." Her children had more questions, but Margaret deflected them. She wasn't ready to explain the full story of Richard Hamilton's credit card. It still felt too fragile, too precious to share widely. The first day of cooking school was intimidating. Margaret arrived early, wearing the new chef's coat, and she had bought the day before. She looked around at her classmates, most of whom were at least 20 years younger than she was. "Welcome to Introduction to Professional Cooking," said Chef Martinez, a stern-looking man with graying hair and intense eyes. "Over the next few weeks, you're going to learn techniques that professional chefs use every day. Some of you think you know how to cook because you cook at home. You're about to discover how much you don't know." Margaret felt a flutter of panic. Maybe Michael was right. Maybe she was too old for this. But, as the class progressed, Margaret discovered that her years of cooking for her family had given her advantages. She knew how to taste and adjust seasoning. She understood timing and organization. She could work quickly and efficiently under pressure. "Very nice knife work," Chef Martinez said, stopping by Margaret's station as she diced onions. "You have good fundamentals." Margaret beamed with pride. She belonged here. As the weeks passed, Margaret threw herself into her studies with an intensity that surprised everyone, including herself. She practiced knife techniques until her fingers ached. She studied food safety regulations until she could recite them in her sleep. She learned about inventory management, cost control, and customer service. But the most valuable lessons came when she started experimenting with her grandmother's recipes, applying professional techniques to traditional flavors. "This mole is incredible," said her classmate Jennifer, a young woman who was planning to open a food truck. "The depth of flavor is amazing. Is this your own recipe?" "My grandmother's," Margaret said with pride. "She taught me that the secret is in the chili preparation and the patience to let the flavors develop slowly." Chef Martinez overheard the conversation and asked Margaret to prepare a small batch of the mole for the class to taste. As her classmates sampled the rich, complex sauce, Margaret watched their faces light up with pleasure. "Mrs. Williams," Chef Martinez said after tasting the mole, "this is restaurant-quality work. Have you considered entering our student competition?" Margaret had heard about the competition, a chance for students to present their own business concept to a panel of local restaurant owners and investors. The winner received mentorship and potential funding to start their business. "I don't know if I'm ready for something like that," Margaret said uncertainly. "I think you underestimate yourself," Chef Martinez replied. "You have something many young chefs lack, a unique perspective and authentic flavors. I encourage you to consider it." That night, Margaret sat in her apartment with her grandmother's recipe book open in front of her. She had been thinking about the competition, about the possibility of actually starting her own business. But doubt crept in as she looked around her small apartment. As she thought about her age, her lack of business experience, her fear of failure. What if she was being foolish? What if this was all just an old woman's fantasy? Margaret picked up her phone and called Richard Hamilton. She hadn't spoken to him since she started school, and she suddenly felt the need to thank him and update him on what she was doing with his gift. "Margaret," Richard's voice was warm and pleased. "How are you? How is everything going?" Margaret told him about the medication for Rosa, the laptop for David, the car repair for Carmen. She told him about enrolling in cooking school, about her classes, about the competition. "That all sounds wonderful," Richard said. "I'm so proud of you for taking such bold steps." "I'm scared," Margaret admitted. "What if I fail? What if I'm making a mistake?" "Then, you'll learn something," Richard said simply. "Failure isn't the opposite of success, Margaret. It's part of success. Every entrepreneur fails at something. The key is to learn from it and keep going." "That's exactly what I hoped you would do." After hanging up, Margaret felt a renewed sense of determination. She would enter the competition. She would present her grandmother's recipes and her vision for a small catering business that would bring authentic Mexican flavors to Los Angeles. She would honor the trust that Richard Hamilton had placed in her by believing in herself. The day of the student competition arrived with all the weight of Margaret's dreams hanging in the balance. She had spent weeks preparing her presentation, practicing her grandmother's mole recipe until she could make it with her eyes closed, and rehearsing her business pitch until the words felt natural on her tongue. Margaret arrived at the culinary school at 6 in the morning, 3 hours before the competition was scheduled to begin. She needed the extra time to prepare her dishes and calm her nerves. Her hands shook slightly as she tied her chef's coat, the same white coat that had seemed so foreign just months ago, but now felt like armor. The competition format was straightforward. Each contestant would present their business concept to a panel of 5 judges, prepare a signature dish, and answer questions about their plans for success. The winner would receive $5,000 in startup funding, 6 months of business mentorship, and connections to potential investors. Margaret's competition was fierce. There was Carlos, a 28-year-old former line cook who wanted to open a gourmet burger food truck. There was Priya, a recent college graduate with plans for a modern Indian fusion restaurant. There was David, a classically trained chef who had worked in some of the city's finest establishments before deciding to start his own catering company. These other contestants have real experience, real training. I'm just an old woman with some family recipes. Stop that right now, Jennifer said firmly. You're not just anything. You're a woman with decades of life experience, with flavors that these young chefs have never even tasted. You belong here just as much as anyone else. Margaret smiled gratefully and began grinding chilies for her mole, the familiar rhythm of the work calming her nerves. This recipe had been in her family for 4 generations. Her great-grandmother had taught it to her grandmother, who had taught it to her mother, who had taught it to Margaret. Each generation had added their own touch, their own understanding of how to balance the complex flavors. As Margaret worked, she thought about all the family gatherings where this mole had been the centerpiece. Birthday parties, holidays, celebrations of graduations, and marriages, and new babies. This wasn't just a recipe. It was a connection to her heritage, to the women who had come before her, to the love that had sustained her family through good times and hard ones. The first contestant, Carlos, presented his gourmet burger concept with confidence and polish. His food was expertly prepared. His business plan was detailed and professional. His presentation was smooth and well-rehearsed. Margaret watched from the sidelines, feeling her confidence ebb. How could she compete with that level of sophistication? Priya was next, presenting her Indian fusion concept with equal professionalism. Her dishes were beautifully plated. Her flavor combinations were innovative and exciting. Her market research was thorough and convincing. By the time David presented his upscale catering concept, complete with financial projections and marketing strategies, Margaret was seriously considering withdrawing from the competition. Margaret Williams, the announcer called. You're up next. Margaret's legs felt unsteady as she walked to the presentation area. The 5 judges sat behind a long table, their expressions neutral and professional. They included Chef Rodriguez, the owner of 3 successful restaurants, Maria Santos, a successful food entrepreneur, James Kim, a restaurant investor, Dr. Patricia Williams, a business professor, and Antonio Reeves, a food critic for the Los Angeles Times. Good morning, Margaret said, her voice barely audible. Good morning, Mrs. Williams, said Chef Rodriguez kindly. Please tell us about your business concept. Margaret took a deep breath and began to speak. Her voice was shaky at first, but it grew stronger as she talked about her grandmother, about the recipes that had been passed down through her family, about her vision for Abuela's kitchen. I want to create a catering business that serves authentic Mexican cuisine made from family recipes that are over a century old, Margaret said. These aren't recipes you can find in cookbooks or learn in school. They come from generations of women who understood that food is love, that feeding people is one of the most important things we can do for each other. As Margaret spoke about her grandmother's journey from Mexico to Los Angeles, about the struggles her family had faced, about the way food had always been the center of their celebrations and comfort, she noticed that the judges were leaning forward, listening intently. My grandmother always said that you can taste the difference between food made with love and food made just for profit, Margaret continued. My business will be built on that principle. Every dish will be made with the same care and attention that my grandmother put into feeding her family. Margaret then moved to the cooking demonstration, preparing her grandmother's mole with practiced ease. As she toasted chilies, ground spices, and slowly built the complex sauce, she explained each step, each decision, each family tradition that informed the process. The secret to good mole, Margaret said as she stirred the simmering sauce, is patience. You cannot rush it. You must let each flavor develop in its own time. Then, bring them together in harmony. My grandmother used to say that mole is like a family. Each ingredient is important, but it's how they work together that creates something beautiful. The aroma of the mole filled the presentation area, rich and complex and utterly distinctive. Margaret could see the judges' expressions changing, their professional neutrality giving way to genuine interest and anticipation. When Margaret presented her finished dish, chicken and mole served with handmade corn tortillas and Mexican rice, the judges tasted it in reverent silence. Chef Rodriguez closed his eyes as he chewed, savoring the complex layers of flavor. Maria Santos made a small sound of pleasure. James Kim immediately took another bite. Dr. Williams nodded approvingly. Antonio Reeves scribbled notes frantically. Mrs. Williams, Chef Rodriguez said after the judges had finished tasting, "This is extraordinary. The depth of flavor, the balance, the authenticity. This is the kind of food that tells a story." "Thank you," Margaret said, feeling tears prick at her eyes. "Tell us about your business plan," said Maria Santos. "How do you envision building a customer base? What's your marketing strategy?" Margaret had prepared for this question, but her business plan was admittedly simple compared to the sophisticated presentations that had preceded hers. "I plan to start small," she said. "Catering for family gatherings, church events, small celebrations. Word of mouth has always been the best advertising for good food. I want to build relationships with my customers, to become part of their important moments." "What about pricing?" asked James Kim. "How will you compete with established catering companies?" "I won't compete on price," Margaret said. "I'll compete on quality and authenticity. People will pay for food that's made with care, food that has a story, food that connects them to something real." Dr. Williams looked at Margaret with interest. "You mentioned that you've been working in domestic service for many years. What made you decide to pursue this business venture now?" Margaret thought about how to answer this question without revealing the full story of Richard Hamilton's credit card. She had decided to keep that part of her journey private, at least for now. "Someone I work for reminded me that it's never too late to pursue your dreams," Margaret said. "I realized that I had been so focused on survival, on taking care of my family, that I had forgotten about the things that brought me joy. Cooking has always been my passion. It just took someone believing in me to help me believe in myself." The judges asked a few more questions about logistics, licensing, and scaling the business. Margaret answered as honestly as she could, acknowledging the areas where she would need to learn and grow. "Thank you, Mrs. Williams," said Chef Rodriguez. "Please wait with the other contestants while we deliberate." Margaret joined Carlos, Priya, and David in the waiting area. The other contestants were friendly but confident, discussing their presentations with the easy assurance of people who expected to succeed. Margaret sat quietly, replaying her presentation in her mind. Had she said enough about the business side? Had her answers been too simple, too unsophisticated? Did her mole taste as good as she thought it did? After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, the judges returned. "This was an incredibly difficult decision," announced Chef Rodriguez. "All 4 presentations showed tremendous potential. However, one contestant stood out for the authenticity of their concept, the quality of their food, and the passion behind their vision." Margaret's heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. The winner of this year's student competition is Margaret Williams with her concept for Abuela's Kitchen. Margaret felt the world spin around her. She heard applause, heard congratulations from her fellow contestants, heard the judges explaining their decision, but it all seemed to be happening to someone else. "Mrs. Williams," said Maria Santos, approaching Margaret after the formal announcement, "I want you to know that your mole was the best I've ever tasted outside of my own grandmother's kitchen. You have something special here." Antonio Reeves, the food critic, was equally enthusiastic. "I've been writing about food for 20 years, and I haven't tasted anything that moved me like this in a very long time. Your story, your food, your passion, it all comes together in something truly remarkable." As Margaret accepted her check for $5,000 and shook hands with her new business mentor, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been invisible, just another domestic worker moving through the world unnoticed. Now she was a culinary school graduate, a business owner, a competition winner. But, more than that, she was someone who had learned to believe in herself again. That evening, Margaret called her children to share the news. Their excitement and pride was overwhelming, and Margaret found herself crying tears of joy as she listened to their congratulations. "Mom, I'm so proud of you," said Carmen. "You've shown all of us that it's never too late to chase your dreams." "Grandma's going to be famous," shouted David in the background, and Margaret laughed through her tears. But the call she was most nervous about making was to Richard Hamilton. She had been thinking about him throughout the competition, knowing that none of this would have been possible without his generosity. "Richard, it's Margaret," she said when he answered the phone. "Margaret, how wonderful to hear from you. How did the competition go? I won, Margaret said, still hardly believing it herself. That's incredible. Richard's excitement was genuine and infectious. I'm so proud of you. Tell me everything. Margaret told him about the competition, about her presentation, about the judge's reaction to her food, about her plans for starting Abuela's kitchen. I can't thank you enough for making this possible, Margaret said. That credit card didn't just give me money. It gave me permission to dream again. You did this, Margaret, Richard said firmly. I just provided an opportunity. You provided the courage, the talent, the hard work. This success is entirely yours. After hanging up, Margaret sat in her small apartment, looking at the check for $5,000 and thinking about everything that had changed in her life. But the real change, she realized, wasn't in her bank account or her career prospects. The real change was in how she saw herself. For the first time in decades, Margaret Williams felt proud of who she was and excited about who she might become. The credit card had been a gift, but the transformation it had enabled was something she had earned through her own courage and determination. 3 months after winning the culinary competition, Margaret Williams stood in the kitchen of what would soon become the first official location of Abuela's Kitchen. The small commercial space in East Los Angeles wasn't much to look at yet, but Margaret could see its potential in every corner. The lease negotiations had been challenging. Many landlords had been skeptical of a 62-year-old woman with no restaurant experience trying to start a catering business. But Margaret's business mentor, Sofia Hernandez, had helped her navigate the process and present a compelling case. You know what convinced me to rent to you, said Mr. Gutierrez, the building's owner, as he handed Margaret the keys. It was when you brought me that sample of your mole. My mother used to make something similar when I was a boy in Mexico City. One taste, and I knew you had something special. Margaret had learned that food was indeed her best advertisement. Every meeting, every negotiation, every conversation about her business was accompanied by small samples of her grandmother's recipes. People might question her business experience, but they couldn't question the quality of her cooking. The first few weeks of setting up the commercial kitchen were overwhelming. There were health department inspections, equipment purchases, supplier relationships to establish, and 1,000 small details that Margaret had never considered when she was dreaming about her business. This is normal, Sophia assured her during one particularly stressful day when the health inspector had found 3 minor violations that needed to be corrected before the kitchen could be approved. Every new business owner feels like they're in over their head at the beginning. Margaret had been working with Sophia for 3 months now, and the relationship had exceeded her expectations. Sophia, a successful restaurant owner who had built her business from the ground up 20 years earlier, understood both the challenges and the opportunities of Margaret's situation. Your age is actually an advantage, Sophia had told her during their first meeting. You have life experience, patience, and perspective that younger entrepreneurs often lack. You also have authentic recipes that can't be replicated by someone who learned them from a cookbook. But Sophia was also honest about the challenges ahead. The food service industry is incredibly demanding. Long hours, thin profit margins, constant pressure. Are you sure you're ready for this? Margaret thought about the question seriously. She was still cleaning houses for 2 families, though she had reduced her workload to create time for her business development. The transition from service work to entrepreneurship was proving to be both exciting and exhausting. I've been working long hours my entire life, Margaret said. The difference is that now I'm working for myself, for my family's future, for something I believe in. The first official catering job for Abuela's Kitchen came through an unexpected source. Jennifer, Margaret's classmate from culinary school, had recommended her to cater a birthday party for her boyfriend's family. It's just 30 people, Jennifer explained. But they specifically wanted authentic Mexican food, and I told them you were the best. Margaret felt a familiar flutter of nerves. This would be her first professional event, her first real test of whether her dreams could become reality. She spent a week planning the menu, sourcing ingredients, and practicing her portions. She would serve her grandmother's mole with chicken, fresh corn tortillas, Mexican rice, refried beans made from scratch, and tres leches cake for dessert. The night before the event, Margaret worked until 2 in the morning, preparing marinades, chopping vegetables, and making the complex mole sauce that required hours of careful attention. Mom, you need to get some sleep, said Carmen, who had come to help with the preparation. I'm too nervous to sleep, Margaret admitted. What if something goes wrong? What if people don't like the food? What if I mess this up? Carmen looked at her mother with a mixture of affection and exasperation. Mom, you've been making this food for our family for decades. Everyone who tastes it falls in love with it. Tomorrow is just a bigger version of every Sunday dinner you've ever made. The event was held in the backyard of a modest house in Highland Park. Margaret arrived 2 hours early to set up, her heart racing as she unpacked her equipment and began the final preparations. The birthday celebration was for a 90-year-old grandmother, Donna Carmen, who was surrounded by 3 generations of her family. As Margaret watched the family interact, she was reminded of her own family gatherings, the way food brought people together across age and cultural differences. When Margaret began serving the food, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Donna Carmen took one bite of the mole and began crying. This tastes just like my mother's mole, she said in Spanish. I haven't tasted anything like this since I was a girl. The older woman's emotional response set the tone for the entire evening. Family members approached Margaret throughout the party to compliment the food and ask about her recipes. Are you available for my daughter's quinceañera next month? Asked one woman. My son is getting married in the spring. Could you cater the rehearsal dinner? Asked another. By the end of the evening, Margaret had bookings for 3 more events, and a dozen business cards had been distributed among the guests. How did it go? Richard Hamilton asked when Margaret called him that night to report on her first catering job. Better than I ever imagined, Margaret said, still glowing from the evening's success. The grandmother started crying when she tasted my mole because it reminded her of her mother's cooking. That's when I knew I was doing something meaningful. That's wonderful, Margaret. It sounds like you're building something special. I am, Margaret said with growing confidence. But, Richard, I need to tell you something. I've been thinking about the credit card, about everything you've done for me. What about it? I've been keeping track of every penny I've spent. The total so far is just over $18,000. I want to start paying you back. Richard was quiet for a moment. Margaret, we've talked about this. That money was a gift, not a loan. I know what you said, but it doesn't feel right to me to keep taking without giving something back. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. The least I can do is show you that your investment was worthwhile. Your success is already showing me that, Richard said gently. Please, Margaret insisted. Let me pay you back. Not all at once, but gradually, as the business grows. It would mean a lot to me. After a long pause, Richard agreed. If it's important to you, then we'll work out a payment plan. But I want you to know that whether you pay me back or not, I'm incredibly proud of what you've accomplished. As autumn turned to winter, Abuela's kitchen began to gain momentum. Word of mouth spread through the Latino community in East Los Angeles, and Margaret found herself booking events weeks in advance. Each event was different, but they all shared certain elements. Families celebrating important moments, food that connected people to their heritage, and Margaret's growing confidence in her ability to create memorable experiences through cooking. The quinceañera for Rosa's daughter was particularly special. Margaret catered for 200 guests, her largest event yet. The celebration was held in a rented hall, and Margaret worked with a team of servers for the first time. I need everything to be perfect, Rosa, the mother of the quinceañera, had told Margaret during their planning meetings. This is my daughter's special day, and I want the food to be something our family remembers forever. The pressure was intense, but Margaret rose to the challenge. She prepared 5 different dishes, including her signature mole, and coordinated with the hall's staff to ensure smooth service throughout the evening. Watching the 15-year-old birthday girl dance with her father while surrounded by family and friends, all of them enjoying food that Margaret had prepared with her own hands, filled Margaret with a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. Mrs. Williams, said the hall manager as Margaret was cleaning up after the event, I've been working events here for 10 years, and I've never seen guests rave about the food the way they did tonight. I'd like to recommend you to other families who book events here. That recommendation led to more bookings, which led to more recommendations, which created a steady stream of business that kept Margaret busy almost every weekend. But success brought new challenges. Margaret was working 7 days a week between her remaining house cleaning clients and her catering business. She was exhausted, and she knew something had to give. The decision to quit her cleaning jobs was not easy. Those paychecks had provided stability for decades, and giving them up felt like stepping off a cliff without knowing if there would be a net below. "Are you sure about this, Mom?" asked Michael during one of their weekly phone calls. "The catering business is still pretty new. What if something goes wrong?" "Then, I'll figure it out," Margaret said with more confidence than she felt. "I can't build Abuela's kitchen into what it needs to be if I'm still spending half my time cleaning other people's houses." The conversation with Richard Hamilton was particularly difficult. He had been her first employer to treat her with genuine respect and kindness, and leaving felt like abandoning a friend. "I'll always be grateful for what you did for me," Margaret told him as she worked in his kitchen for the final time. "You changed my life." "You changed your life," Richard corrected her. "I just gave you a push in the right direction." "Will you be my first official business client?" Margaret asked. "I'd love to cater your next dinner party." Richard smiled. "I thought you'd never ask. Emma is having her 18th birthday party next month, and Sarah has been looking for a caterer who can do something special." Margaret's first upscale catering event was a nerve-wracking experience. The Hamilton family's social circle included successful business people, celebrities, and other wealthy families. Margaret worried that her simple, traditional cooking wouldn't be sophisticated enough for such an elegant crowd. But she needn't have worried. The combination of authentic flavors and Margaret's obvious passion for her craft created exactly the kind of memorable experience that wealthy clients were seeking. "This is the most delicious food I've ever had at a party," one guest told Margaret. "Do you have a card? I'm planning my daughter's wedding reception." By the end of the evening, Margaret had collected contact information from a dozen potential clients, including several high-profile families who were planning major events in the coming year. "Margaret," said Sarah Hamilton as the evening was winding down, "I want you to know that Richard told us about the credit card, about how this all started. What you've done with that opportunity is truly inspiring." Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes. "Your husband saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. He gave me permission to dream again. And you turned that dream into something beautiful," Sarah replied. 2 years after receiving Richard Hamilton's credit card, Margaret Williams stood before a packed auditorium at the University of Southern California, preparing to give a speech about entrepreneurship and second chances. The irony was not lost on her that she, who had spent most of her adult life invisible to the very people now hanging on her every word, was being celebrated as an inspiration. Abuela's kitchen had grown beyond Margaret's wildest dreams. What had started as a small catering business had evolved into a thriving enterprise with a commercial kitchen, 3 full-time employees, and a waiting list for events that stretched months into the future. Margaret had been featured in Los Angeles Magazine, profiled in the local Spanish-language television news, and invited to cater events for some of the city's most prominent families. But success had not come without challenges. The rapid growth of the business had required Margaret to learn skills she had never imagined needing. She had mastered inventory management, employee scheduling, tax planning, and marketing strategies. She had navigated equipment failures, difficult clients, and the constant pressure of maintaining quality while scaling operations. "The thing about running a business," Margaret told the audience of business students, "is that every day brings new problems you've never faced before. The key is to approach each challenge as a learning opportunity rather than a threat." The speech was part of a symposium on entrepreneurship that the university hosted annually. Margaret had been invited to speak alongside CEOs of major corporations and venture capitalists who managed billion-dollar funds. 2 years ago, she would have been intimidated by such company. Now, she understood that success came in many forms, and her story was just as valuable as anyone else's. In the audience, Richard Hamilton sat with his wife Sarah and daughter Emma, who was now a sophomore at USC studying business administration. Richard had been following Margaret's journey closely, celebrating each milestone and offering advice when asked. Their relationship had evolved from employer and employee to genuine friendship built on mutual respect and admiration. "When I first gave Margaret that credit card," Richard had told the symposium organizers when they asked why he wanted to attend her speech, "I thought I was helping someone in need. I didn't realize I was investing in a future business leader who would inspire thousands of people." Margaret's speech focused on the lessons she had learned during her entrepreneurial journey. She talked about the importance of authenticity in business, about building relationships with customers based on trust and quality, and about the value of persistence in the face of obstacles. I spent 37 years believing that my role in life was to make other people's lives better while remaining invisible myself, Margaret said, her voice strong and clear. I thought that was enough, that it was all I was meant for. It took one person's kindness to help me understand that I had value beyond my service to others. After the speech, Margaret was surrounded by students asking questions about starting businesses, overcoming obstacles, and finding the courage to pursue dreams later in life. Their enthusiasm and energy reminded her of her own transformation, the way hope and possibility had slowly replaced doubt and resignation. "Mrs. Williams," said a young Latina student named Isabella, "my grandmother has recipes that have been in our family for generations, just like yours. Do you think I could start a food business too?" Margaret looked at the young woman's eager face and saw herself 2 years ago, full of dreams but uncertain about her worth. "Tell me about your grandmother's recipes," Margaret said, settling in for a long conversation. That evening, Margaret attended a dinner hosted by the university's business school. She found herself seated at the head table between a tech entrepreneur who had sold his company for $50 million and a woman who had built a national retail chain from a single store. "I have to ask," said the tech entrepreneur, "what's your secret? How did you build such a successful business so quickly?" Margaret thought about the question carefully. "I think it was because I wasn't trying to build a business at first. I was trying to honor my grandmother's memory and share something I loved with other people. The business part came later, when I realized that love and respect for tradition could be the foundation of something bigger." The retail chain owner nodded knowingly. Authenticity is everything in business today. Customers can sense when something is real versus when it's manufactured for profit. You can't fake the kind of passion you have for your food and your heritage. As the evening progressed, Margaret found herself exchanging business cards and discussing potential collaborations with successful entrepreneurs who saw her as an equal, a peer worthy of their respect and attention. The contrast with her life just 2 years earlier was so stark that it sometimes felt surreal. She remembered the feeling of being invisible, of moving through the world without anyone acknowledging her intelligence, creativity, or potential. Now she was being courted for partnerships, invited to exclusive events, and recognized as an expert in her field. But the most meaningful change was not in how others saw her, but in how she saw herself. The next morning, Margaret returned to the commercial kitchen where Abuela's kitchen operated. Her 3 employees, Maria, Carlos, and Diana, were already busy preparing for the weekend's events. Margaret had hired each of them after careful consideration, looking for people who shared her commitment to quality and authentic flavors. "How did the speech go last night?" asked Maria, who had become Margaret's sous chef and trusted lieutenant. "Better than I expected," Margaret said, tying on her apron. "I think we might have some new customers from the university community." Margaret had learned to be strategic about growth. Each new client, each new opportunity was evaluated not just for its immediate profitability, but for its alignment with Abuela's kitchen's mission and values. She had turned down several high-paying events that would have required compromising her standards or overextending her resources. Slow and steady, she often told Maria when discussing expansion plans. "We build this business one satisfied customer at a time." The morning's work involved preparing for a quinceañera that evening, an event for 150 guests that would showcase the full range of Abuela's kitchen's offerings. Margaret still insisted on personally overseeing every aspect of large events, from the initial menu planning to the final plate that went out to guests. As she stirred a large pot of mole, adjusting the seasoning with the practiced instinct that came from decades of cooking, Margaret thought about her grandmother, who had started this culinary journey so many generations ago. "Mija," her grandmother used to say, "when you cook with love, that love goes into the food and feeds people's souls, not just their bodies." Margaret had understood those words intellectually for years, but only recently had she grasped their full meaning. Abuela's Kitchen was not just a catering business. It was a way of nourishing community, preserving culture, and creating connections between people through the shared experience of authentic food. The quinceañera that evening was a perfect example of what Margaret had learned to create. The celebration was held in the family's backyard, transformed with lights and decorations into a magical space where 3 generations gathered to honor a young woman's transition to adulthood. As Margaret watched the 15-year-old birthday girl dance with her father while surrounded by family and friends enjoying food prepared with Margaret's own hands, she felt the deep satisfaction that came from contributing to life's most important moments. "Mrs. Williams," said the girl's grandmother, approaching Margaret as the evening was winding down, "I want to thank you. This food, it reminds me of my own mother's cooking. You've brought back memories I thought were lost forever." These moments, Margaret had learned, were the true measure of her success. Not the money in the bank account, not the recognition in magazines, but the connections she was able to create between people and their heritage, between families and their traditions. 2 weeks later, Margaret received a call that would mark another milestone in her journey. "Mrs. Williams, this is Chef Martinez from the culinary school. I have an opportunity I'd like to discuss with you." Chef Martinez explained that the school was developing a new program focused on traditional and ethnic cuisines, and they wanted Margaret to teach a course on authentic Mexican cooking and food entrepreneurship. "Teaching," Margaret said, surprised by the offer. "I'm not sure I'm qualified to teach." "You're more qualified than anyone I know," Chef Martinez replied. "You have authentic knowledge, real-world business experience, and the ability to inspire students. That's exactly what we're looking for." The idea of teaching filled Margaret with both excitement and nervousness. She remembered her own first day at culinary school, how intimidated she had felt surrounded by younger students with more formal training. But she also remembered how Chef Martinez had encouraged her to enter the competition that had launched her business, how he had seen potential in her when she couldn't see it herself. "I'd be honored to teach," Margaret said finally. "When do we start?" The first class Margaret taught was both terrifying and exhilarating. Standing in front of 24 students, ranging in age from 18 to 55, she felt the weight of responsibility to share not just techniques and recipes, but wisdom and inspiration. "Today we're going to talk about more than cooking," Margaret began. "We're going to talk about the story that food tells, about the connections it creates, about the way authenticity can be the foundation of a successful business." As the semester progressed, Margaret discovered that she loved teaching almost as much as she loved cooking. Her students included young culinary school graduates looking to specialize in ethnic cuisines, career changers seeking new opportunities, and experienced cooks wanting to turn family recipes into businesses. Each student's story reminded Margaret of her own journey, the way dreams could lie dormant for years before the right opportunity brought them to life. One of her students, a 48-year-old woman named Rosa who had immigrated from El Salvador, approached Margaret after class one day. "Professor Williams," Rosa said hesitantly, "I have my grandmother's pupusa recipes, but I'm afraid they're not sophisticated enough for a restaurant business." Margaret smiled, remembering her own fears about whether her grandmother's recipes were good enough for professional kitchens. "Rosa, sophistication isn't about complexity. It's about authenticity, quality, and the story behind the food. If your grandmother's pupusas are made with love and traditional techniques, they're sophisticated enough for any restaurant." 6 months later, Rosa opened her own small restaurant featuring authentic Salvadoran cuisine. Margaret attended the grand opening, proud to see another woman taking the leap from dreams to reality. As Margaret's second year as an entrepreneur came to a close, she made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She called Richard Hamilton and asked to meet him for lunch. They met at a small restaurant in downtown Los Angeles, the kind of place where Margaret had always felt most comfortable, surrounded by working families enjoying simple, honest food. "I have something for you," Margaret said, pulling an envelope from her purse. Inside the envelope was a check for $50,000, the full amount of credit that Richard had made available to her 2 years earlier. "Margaret," Richard said, looking at the check in surprise, "we talked about this. The money was a gift." "And this is a gift too," Margaret said firmly. "A gift from someone who learned the importance of paying kindness forward." Richard looked at the check again, then at Margaret's determined face. "What do you want me to do with this?" Margaret smiled. I want you to find someone else who needs what you gave me. Someone who has dreams, but not opportunities. Someone who just needs one person to believe in them. You want me to give this money to someone else. I want you to start a foundation, a program, something that helps people like I used to be. People who are invisible, who have given up on their dreams, who just need someone to see their potential. Richard was quiet for a long moment, turning the check over in his hands. This is an incredible gesture, Margaret. Are you sure this is what you want to do? It's what my grandmother would have wanted me to do, Margaret said. She always taught me that when we receive blessings, we have a responsibility to share them with others. 6 months later, the Hamilton Foundation for Second Chances was officially launched, with Margaret serving on the board of directors alongside Richard, Sarah, and several other successful entrepreneurs who had overcome significant obstacles. The foundation's mission was simple: to provide financial support and mentorship to people over 40 who were pursuing new careers or starting businesses later in life. The first recipient was a 53-year-old man named James who had been laid off from his manufacturing job and wanted to start a handyman service. The second was a 46-year-old woman named Patricia who had always dreamed of opening a bookstore but had never had the capital to get started. Each recipient reminded Margaret of her own journey, the way one person's kindness could change the entire trajectory of a life. As Margaret stood in her expanded commercial kitchen one morning, watching her team prepare for the day's events, she thought about the unexpected path that had brought her to this point. 3 years ago, she had been Margaret Williams, the invisible housekeeper. Now she was Margaret Williams, successful entrepreneur, teacher, and advocate for second chances. But the most important transformation had been internal. She had learned to see herself as someone worthy of investment, someone with valuable knowledge and skills, someone whose dreams mattered. The credit card had been just the beginning. What Richard Hamilton had really given her was permission to believe in herself, to imagine a different future, to take risks in pursuit of something better. And in learning to believe in herself, Margaret had discovered the importance of helping others do the same. That evening, as Margaret locked up the kitchen and headed home to her new apartment, she passed a woman waiting at the bus stop. The woman looked tired, invisible in the way that Margaret remembered feeling for so many years. Margaret paused, thinking about her grandmother's words about kindness, about the foundation's mission, about the power of seeing people who were overlooked by the rest of the world. "Excuse me," Margaret said to the woman. "Are you okay? Do you need help with anything?" The woman looked up, surprised to be acknowledged. "I'm fine, just waiting for the bus home from work." "What kind of work do you do?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious. "I clean offices downtown," the woman said. "Been doing it for about 15 years. Margaret smiled, remembering her own years of cleaning other people's spaces. "That's important work. I used to clean houses myself." As they talked, Margaret learned that the woman, whose name was Carmen, had always dreamed of opening a small beauty salon but had never had the resources to pursue training or start a business. "Dreams are important," Margaret said as the bus approached. "Don't give up on yours." As Carmen's bus pulled away, Margaret pulled out her phone and called Richard Hamilton. "Richard, it's Margaret. I think I found our next foundation recipient." The cycle of kindness, belief, and transformation was continuing, one person at a time, one dream at a time, one moment of recognition at a time. Margaret Williams had learned that the most powerful gift anyone could give was the simple act of seeing another person's potential and helping them see it too. And in a world where so many people felt invisible, that gift was more valuable than any credit card could ever be. For as Margaret drove home that night, past the bright lights of Beverly Hills toward her small apartment in East Los Angeles, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. A year ago, she had been invisible, moving through the world without anyone noticing her hopes or dreams or potential. Now she was a successful entrepreneur, building a business that brought joy to families and honored her cultural heritage. But more than that, she had learned something valuable about the power of kindness and belief. Richard Hamilton had given her more than money. He had given her dignity, respect, and the chance to see herself as someone worthy of investment. Margaret pulled into her parking space and looked up at the small apartment that had been her home for 15 years. Soon, she hoped, she would be able to move into something bigger, something more comfortable for her growing business and her family. But tonight, this small space felt like a palace. It was the home of Margaret Williams, successful entrepreneur and keeper of her grandmother's culinary legacy. And tomorrow would bring new opportunities to share that legacy with the world. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of turning Abuela's kitchen from a dream into a reality. She would apply for business licenses, develop a marketing plan, and start building the customer base that would sustain her new venture. But tonight, she would call her sister Rosa, her children, her grandchildren, and anyone else who would listen. She would tell them about her victory, about her plans, about the new chapter of her life that was just beginning. Margaret Williams, the entrepreneur, the chef, the keeper of her grandmother's legacy, had arrived. And she was just getting started. The next morning, Margaret submitted her application for the student competition. Her business concept was simple but heartfelt. Abuela's Kitchen, a catering company specializing in traditional Mexican cuisine made from family recipes passed down through generations. As she walked out of the school that day, Margaret felt like she was walking into a new chapter of her life. She was no longer just Margaret Williams, the woman who cleaned houses. She was Margaret Williams, the entrepreneur, the student, the keeper of her grandmother's culinary legacy. The credit card in her purse had given her more than financial freedom. It had given her permission to dream again, to believe that her life could be more than just survival. And for the first time in decades, Margaret was excited about what tomorrow might bring. Her work had meaning beyond the paycheck. She felt valued, respected, and trusted, and that feeling was worth more than any credit card. But the question remained, what would she do with this unexpected gift? How would she use this opportunity to change not just her own life, but the lives of the people she loved? Margaret looked at the credit card one more time, then carefully placed it in her purse. She had a choice to make, and she knew that whatever she decided would define not just her future, but her character. The next chapter of her life was about to begin, and for the first time in decades, Margaret Williams felt like she had the power to write her own story.